That was the really scary thing about the Trump stuff. Like when they were trying to get him for 34 felony counts, none of those were a felony. All of them were past the statute of limitations. It was just when we thought Trump was going to come in and a lot of things were going to be resolved. We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to figure everything out. And when you have this one hardcore line in the sand that everybody had been talking about forever, and then they're trying to gaslight you on that.
The peak of the Joe Rogan era may be coming to an end through no one's hands but his own, and it makes me wonder how we got here. The man who once gave voice to the aggrieved white man, the so-called average Joe, ended up serving more as a mouthpiece for conservative ideologies, or perhaps more accurately, an incubator for those seeking to amplify their public profiles. But to fully understand how the shift happened, it is worth acknowledging that Rogan in many ways became a victim of his own success. The same open-door platform that made him a cultural force also became the stage for louder, more extreme voices. Voices he may not have intended to champion, but which eventually defined him. And to understand that, it's best to start at the beginning, or at least the beginning as it's relevant to this discussion. I'm also going to use comedian Bill Burr as a brief example of an alternative to white masculinity as promoted by the far right. Now, in Western capitalist societies, white men are socially engineered to embody the normative subject position at the top of both the racial and gender hierarchies. This confers on an internalized privilege, one that often goes unchecked because it's so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. It creates what can be described as embodied dominance, a belief that their opinions are naturally valid, their presence automatically warranted, and their access to space, regardless of expertise, entirely justified. This isn't always malicious or conscious, but it is systemic, and few public figures illustrate the contrasting ways this dynamic can manifest better than Joe Rogan and Bill Burr. Now, I'll mostly be focusing on Rogan today. His story in particular is relevant, and it's fascinating to see how he fumbled his way to the top. I've got something different in line for Bill Burr in a video coming out next month, and I don't feel like repeating myself. And before we get started, I want to thank my YouTube and Patreon subscribers. Their names should be popping up on screen somewhere now. I really appreciate the support, and get ready because I'm just getting started on an Old Thought Next Door commentary, and this gets so weird. I plan on doing some more commentary style videos, just rough ones off the cuff. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Now back to your scheduled broadcast. Now, Joe was born in the late 60s in Newark, New Jersey, about an hour and a half north of Philly and just outside New York. Now, even though Joe was born in Jersey, he grew up in Boston. So instead of New York, which was a booming hub, he actually cut his teeth on the Boston comic scene around the likes of Dennis Leary, Lenny Clark, Paula Poundstone. And I think his Boston start helped him out far more than if he started out in New York. You see, this is just one of many examples of Joe Rogan being at the right place at the right time. While Boston was a burgeoning comedy hub, New York, the city that Rogan didn't start in, was already bustling, and Rogan would have been drowned out in the noise. He wouldn't have stood a chance against a young Adam Sandler or Chris Rock. Bill Burr would have smoked him, and Dave Attell would have ate his lunch. And I think he knew that, because, well, Joe isn't that funny. And that's not a real dig. Joe Rogan doesn't think Joe Rogan is funny. Now, as we'll be getting into, an alternative to Joe Rogan has always been there for white men. I just don't think they ever gave him enough credit because, like most sensible people, he tends to stay out of the dumb shit. I'm referring to Bill Burr, someone whose career I've been following since I was a kid and he had red hair. But he has the same style of matter-of-fact, in-your-face comedy. The difference is, 1, Bill Burr is actually funny, and 2, he stays in the lane he established for himself. He doesn't speak on issues he really has no expertise in, and he has a more general approach to how he engages with people. Basically, in terms of positive white masculinity, he's a far better representation than Joe Rogan. Now, as I just mentioned, Rogan got his start in the Boston comedy scene, but he wasn't a draw by any means. No. His real time in the spotlight came from his stint on the sitcom NewsRadio from 1994 to 95, playing the character Joe Gorelli, the resident handyman and electrician. And what's wild is, I actually saw this show when it was on the air. I mean, I was only 5 when the pilot aired, but I remember Phil Hartman and Andy Dick. I didn't remember Joe Rogan though. He wouldn't hit my radar for another few years, but let that marinate. But something perhaps serendipitous happened in season 2. Joe has to fill in for Andy Dick's character on the radio, and surprisingly to everyone around him, his character absolutely crushes it.
This is Joe Gorelli filling in for Catherine Duke. The world of stock car racing was shaken today when NASCAR legend Travis Sullivan announced his retirement. Sullivan, a 3-time Winston Cup winner who's been on the circuit for 30 years, plans to spend more time with his family.
In hindsight, this moment feels like a metaphor for what would come. Rogan had that kind of neutral mask appeal, a term used in theory to describe a character who is blank enough that anyone can project themselves onto them. In simpler terms, he was like a mirror, not too loud, not too defiant, just a relatable way enough that people saw what they wanted to see. He was like the everyman without too many sharp edges. Little did we all know that just under 14 years later, he'd be hosting his own radio show, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, in an interview with Shaq back in 2008, right after the Mencia blow-up, which I'll be getting into in a second, Rogan said this in an interview. "I never really had any ambitions to be a stand-up comic. I was talked into it by the guys I used to work out with. I was always cracking them up in our locker room doing impressions of our friends or talking about our girls dating that was a huge feminist. She's actually part of my act now. And my buddy Ed was always telling me to do stand-up. I never really thought people would think I was funny. I thought my friends thought I was funny because I was their friend. Other people would just think I was an asshole. At least I was partly right. That's actually one of the keys to my act. My act is so completely and totally uncensored that the only way I can really pull it off is if I treat audience like they're my best friends and I talk to them completely honestly. People for the most part can smell lies, at least that's what I thought until I saw their audiences applauding Carlos Mencia. Now Joe's big break came from doing exactly that. Being an asshole during a set at the Comedy Store, one of the most prominent venues for stand-up in LA. Rogan interrupted this at a rising comedian, Carlos Mencia. Now at the time, it was kind of an open secret that Mencia was stealing material from other comedians, which in the comedy world is basically unforgivable, like career death level stuff. And some of the biggest names have been accused of joke theft. Dennis Leary, Robin Williams, Dane Cook, RIP to his career, but no one really called it out in real time. Rogan did. He marched on stage and said what everyone was thinking.
Here's the deal.
You are a good performer. You do very well with other people's shit.
I do well with my shit. My shit. It's been my shit.
You
by the way,
stolen a joke?
no, I've never stolen a
George
joke.
Lopez can grab you by your fucking neck and slam you up against the left back of the wall for ripping off his shit.
he
You ain't
did.
feel special?
He did.
You
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
You fucking liar.
Yes, he did. But you know what's for ripping off
You're a
that
fucking liar, bro.
That's not why.
You didn't do it to me.
You know what?
George Lopez said me. Give me a hug. What's up?
But you don't interrupt someone's set. That's sacred ground. But in doing so, Rogan marked himself as a man of integrity, or at least someone with the guts to uphold the unwritten rules of the craft. So even though he got banned from the Comedy Store and caught flack for being a drunken asshole, behind the scenes he earned a kind of quiet respect. You know, a pat on the back from the comedy world, if you will. He became the guy who would say the quiet part out loud, and that kind of raw honesty would become the foundation of his future persona. And I've often heard that success can be more attributed to who you know rather than what you know. And for Joe Rogan, that was definitely the case because, and I'm being serious, Rogan makes a far better host than he ever did a comedian. I don't deny that he has charisma and reach to a very specific audience. It's just that audience happens to be one of the largest marketing demos in the world, white guys in between 14 and 40. And one thing I'll give him a little extra credit for, or rather I'll credit his success to, from what I can dig up, Rogan was a likable dude among his peers. He wasn't that funny, but he was a comedian's comedian, the kind of dude that could hang out at a spot like the Comedy Store and be respected by his peers while being C-tier at his absolute peak. And I'm being generous. But again, his success didn't come from his stand-up. His time as a host of Fear Factor really helped cement him in the public zeitgeist. You see, his comedy roots, his particular abrasive, no-filter attitude-era style, the sharp edge, macho, and occasionally juvenile, translated really well to the show's premise. Fear Factor wasn't about wit or nuance, it was about watching people confront visceral, primal fears while someone hyped them up from the sideline. Big bucks and big embarrassment on the line, and Rogan was perfect for that. The show itself followed a brutal reality competition format. A group of contestants competed in a series of terrifying and/or disgusting stunts. These range from navigating dangerous obstacle courses to consuming revolting items like cow eyeballs or a maggot smoothie.
Next, Fear Factor.
Maggot juice!
Blended maggot and fly shake.
Here comes the pain.
Ready, let's go! Eat this back! Eat this back!
Oh my god, there's blood hanging from your mouth!
At the end, one person walked away with the cash prize and possible emotional trauma. And my favorite was when the contestants had to eat balut, this Filipino egg delicacy. Basically, it's like a fertilized and fermented egg, so part of a developing chick inside. Anyway, one dude chokes down enough to win, and cool as a cucumber, like he was just asking for directions, he goes, Can I throw up now? She gets permission, politely walks off screen, and pukes his guts out. Like, absolutely hilarious. And Rogan's role wasn't just to explain the rules. He taunted, questioned, and occasionally offered unexpected moments of empathy, reminding them like, hey, you can forfeit. You're going to lose that money, but you can quit. But you know, that also served as a little guard against additional insurance liability. You can't be hyping people up into doing something trifling without giving them that exit. And his commentary was designed for added tension and humor in equal measure, acting as both hype man and psychological pressure point. While other hosts might have softened the edges, Rogan leaned in, making his Fear Factor tenure feel more like a raw, unscripted sports event than a standard game show. It's no coincidence that Fear Factor fit snugly into that early 2000s media landscape, a time when shock value ruled and reality TV was just starting to flex its chaotic potential. Rogan wasn't there to elevate the format. His personality was the format, embodying the same confrontational, spectacle-driven energy that has made the show a hit. The other show Rogan took over in the 2000s was The Man Show. The Man Show was one of those late 90s, early 2000s artifacts that felt like a rite of passage for a teenage boy. It's loud, irreverent, and proudly juvenile, and as a teenager, I loved it. The beer chugging, the dirty jokes, the girl on trampoline closing segment, the whole guy code aesthetic, it all felt like forbidden TV. The kind of show I had to watch with the volume low so my parents wouldn't hear it. But that's also because it was weird white dude stuff that was also a little adult. Like if I was watching Comic View, they wouldn't have reacted, but you know. Tomato, potato. It was marked as satire, but let's just be honest, it mostly gave permission to be obnoxious. And conservatives want to ban drag queens because they want to promote that queers groom kids. But I didn't watch a queer man show. I watched a straight one ran by men that mostly identify as conservative. But like a lot of content from that era, revisiting the Man Show feels less funny and more lecherous. That's a show I never really had the language for back then, but it fits. The show didn't just flirt with objectification, it invited it over, handed it a beer, and asked it to jump on a trampoline. What once felt rebellious now mostly feels like a crash course on Arrested Development, and as a person that escaped the fuckery, it's just really cringe. Now, Joe Rogan and comedian Doug Stanhope actually took over the hosting duties in 2003 after the original creators Jimmy Kimmel and Adam Carolla stepped away.
Worst moments in man history. 1920. Men give women the right to vote.
Women are voting. Seems like almost every year now, all thanks to the woman's suffrage movement.
Led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, pioneers in the field of bitching, moaning, and complaining.
But after all their struggle and sacrifice, how many women today even know what the word suffrage means?
Yeah, that Jimmy Kimmel. And their version dialed up the edge even more.
Comedy Central actually did some research, and they discovered that a huge portion of our audience is actually in prison.
Yeah, apparently inmates, they like to watch our show while they pull balloons full of heroin out of their ass.
It's a hobby. Don't judge. So to boost the ratings, the network considered changing the format. Here's what it would have looked like.
Next up in our ways not to get prison. Become someone's bitch. Yeah. That way it's consensual.
While Kimmel and Carolla at least flirted with the idea of mocking masculinity, Rogan and Stanhope leaned into it, less wink and a nod, more leer and a grope.
Well, hello.
Their run of the Man Show was darker, less aggressive, and somehow even less self-aware. There were points when even I was like, are you sure y'all can show that on TV? Now, in retrospect, it's easy to see that the Man Show was a reflection of its time, pre-social media, pre-#MeToo, and steeped in the idea that being offensive was the same as being bold, and it's just a reflection of the crude humor of the 80s that was tightened up a bit before that edgy early 2000s era. It's cyclical. Edgy things are deemed funny just for the sake of going against the grain, people get offended, A little nuance is added, at least from the talented creators, and the cycle continues towards the next sociological powder keg. The hacks just get offended and pretend their rights are being infringed upon. Now, Rogan's involvement in the Man Show, especially that second iteration, wasn't out of place. It was actually a warm-up for the persona he later bring to his podcast. Crass, confrontational, and willing to ask the dumbest questions with complete seriousness.
Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out!
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day!
The beginning of our experience with Joe Rogan truly begins in 2009 when he starts his podcast.
Start broadcast. And then
Update to Twitter.
Update to Twitter.
Hello, world. The fuck is going on? The questions are coming in now. How you guys doing? We're doing swell.
And that first episode was dog shit. Of course it sucked. His first time out, barely knowing how the tech works, it was a shit show. And that's not a dig. A lot of first projects are trash. My first video on here was so bad that not only did I take it down, but I deleted all the source files. For Joe Rogan to have a crappy first episode, it was on par. But years of practice mic work in comedy clubs and on TV had prepared him for podcast work, and it also laid a foundation for his future conspiracies and platforming of conspiracy theorists. What the episode lacked in production value, it made up for in raw potential. Years of performing in comedy clubs, hosting TV shows like Fear Factor and Riffing Live had given Rogan an uncanny ability to keep a conversation going no matter how aimless. And more importantly, it laid a foundation for the future JRE formula. A little bit of bro science, a little bit of speculation, and a whole lot of what if.
I think chemtrails are a silly one. Not to say they haven't sprayed people before. Not to say that there haven't been some experiments where they've sprayed, a certain bacteria or certain colds, over an area to see if they can get people sick. Well, why not? We know there's a thing called Operation Midnight Climax. That in the 1950s, the CIA ran fucking brothels. They ran whorehouses in New York and San Francisco. And they ran these things, and what they did was they ran the whorehouse so they can do LSD experiments on people. And so they unknowingly gave these Johns acid. So these poor guys would go in there just to try to give their, their hard-earned money. They probably, didn't even have much. Pay just whatever they had to get their dick sucked. And they're getting dosed with acid, freaking the fuck out, probably already feeling super guilty. Probably half of them were married and they just cheating on their wives and they felt guilty about that. And then they're dosed up with acid and dealing with the reality of the situation. I mean, we know the CIA did that. This is information that was released in the Freedom of Information Act. You look it up, Google it. It's pretty interesting. It's called Operation Midnight Climax. And it's just
one early favorite topic, Operation Midnight Climax. If you've never heard of it, Operation Midnight Climax was a real CIA program in the 1950s and 60s, part of a larger MK Ultra project. Once inside, these men were dosed with LSD without their knowledge, so CIA operatives could observe their behavior under influence. And it sounds like a plot of a dystopian sci-fi show, but it's real. I didn't believe Joe Rogan until I looked it up myself. It's very real. The goal, mind control, behavioral manipulation, and interrogation techniques. The result, a legacy of state-sponsored trauma and a field day for conspiracy theories. Which is wild because anyone who's ever done LSD, this guy, and damn near every hippie in the 60s could tell you that mind control or behavioral manipulation wouldn't work. And mentioning Operation Midnight Climax on his podcast, and Rogan has multiple times, wasn't just a quirky history tangent, it was a signal. Rogan has always used these moments to suggest if something wild could happen and be true, then maybe all the other conspiracies aren't so far-fetched.
What made you make the switch from like being a moon landing denier to like
That's a good question.
Crazy if we didn't. If you don't.
No, I don't think we're crazy. No, this is my take on it.
Hey, what's going on, y'all? Editing Charlie here. I'm using this clip of Joe Rogan to really emphasize my point of how dangerous it is to just ask questions. I want you to notice how he prefaces the beginning of his statement, basically explaining he has no idea what the hell he's talking about, and yet continues to just spread random disinformation or conspiracy theories because of how interesting or engaging he finds it. The troubling part is most people are going to completely disregard the fact where he says, I don't know what I'm talking about. They're just going to follow the wave of what he's saying and when it's not something as trivial as the moon landing, when it's getting to vaccine disinformation or Republican politics or anything else that's currently destroying our country, it gets a little bit more hinky. Yeah, see for yourself.
Absolutely. I don't know enough about astrophysics, about space travel, about the science that's, the work that's been done, about how to get a rocket to the moon and back. I definitely don't know enough.
It's rocket science.
And I've looked at a lot of very compelling documentaries that explain why they think it was hoaxed. And they'll show you some footage, and you can look at some of the footage, and it looks fake as fuck. There's some footage that, to me, looks really doctored. There's
to this day?
Yeah, to this day. There's some when you ever seen ones where it looks like they're on wires, like the astronauts are on wires?
I have.
There's some where there's a video where they look like they're on a trampoline. They're bouncing around on trampolines. Mm-hmm. The physics are different.
Aliens, shadow governments, vaccine paranoia, it all becomes part of the same slippery web of just asking questions. Joe Rogan, for all his claims of being a free thinker and just asking questions, is actually a textbook example of the interviewer effect. As a white man with a massive platform, his guests often calibrate their responses based on his identity whether they realize it or not. Research shows that people tend to offer more socially desirable, agreeable, or subdued responses when questioned by someone they perceive to have a higher social status or cultural alignment. In Rogan's case, that status isn't earned through journalistic rigor or intellectual consistency. It's inherited from a cultural template of who we are conditioned to trust. His audits and guests often take his questions at face value even when they're poorly formed or based on misinformation because his whiteness and his masculinity implicitly authorize them. And this is where the false neutrality comes in. Rogan often frames himself as a centrist, a neutral host merely providing a space for discussion. But this so-called centrism is an illusion. It's a cover for selective bias. He disproportionately platforms reactionary voices, conspiracy theories, and culture war figures and rarely holds them accountable. His claim of balance is undermined by the algorithm of his own show. He's not a centrist in content, only in posture. A white man playing both sides of the fence while giving more real estate to one. Rogan's entire podcast brand is built on the idea of open conversation, of just asking questions. But the problem is he's not asking questions in a vacuum. His platform, now one of the most influential in the world, gives airtime to ideas that range from fringe to full-on deranged. And more importantly, he allows others to just ask questions too, creating a pipeline for racist misinformation, climate change denial, anti-vax rhetoric, and all under the guise of intellectual curiosity.
Here comes a new challenger! My question is ultimately, when you think of talking about politics at all in your act, what do you want to do, right?
If I do it, I trash them both.
Yeah. With what?
Because that is my job. That is my job. I can't fix the political system, and I don't watch a lot of it. But, when I do stand up, if I start trashing like Trump, I would hear the left in the crowd like, yeah. And I'd be like, the fuck, you voted for a guy that, is staring off into space. Mm-hmm. Like your guy literally should be in a fucking home. What are you patting yourself on the back for? X, Y, and Z, blah, blah. Your fucking party has not let you has not let you choose your candidate since Obama's second term.
Yeah.
You're liberal? That's fucking insane. We want Bernie Sanders. Fuck you, Hillary. We want Bernie Sanders. Fuck you, fucking Mr. Magoo. Mr. Magoo again, fucking 2 weeks before. His vice president.
Yeah.
Bill Burr, by contrast, doesn't hide behind neutrality. He's blunt, often abrasive, but his critiques usually aim upward. Not pretending to be above the culture war. He openly mocks both liberal performativity and conservative hypocrisy. Unlike Rogan, who uses ignorance as a defense, I don't know, I'm just asking questions, Burr embraces his ignorance as something to be unpacked, not platformed. He's more self-aware, more skeptical of male entitlement, and far less inclined to glorify the idea of being an outsider when he's very much an insider to the structures of power. Bill Burr also walks the walk when it comes to being a logical centrist. He doesn't pander to any one ideology. He criticizes cancel culture and toxic masculinity. He's rallied against both corporate wokeness and right-wing fear-mongering. Where Rogan gives voice to people who reinforce the very power structures he claims to question, Burr uses his voice to poke holes in those structures and himself. He doesn't center himself as a final authority on social issues, and he certainly doesn't pretend his platform is apolitical. Hey, what's going on, y'all? Editing Charlie here. This is a lot of Bill Burr glaze, but I'm really trying to show a comparison point to what we usually get out of the Rogan sphere and comparable white masculine faces. This is something that could very easily be the face of white masculinity instead of a Joe Rogan type. I think men just need to know when to redirect their anger towards the proper sources. Aligning with someone that is, for lack of a better word, kind of an asshole is building a bridge towards someone who might be left-leaning or whoever else that they can find to be a sensible source of information. Yeah, that's it. Back to the show. Look, it's not just who Joe Rogan invites on his podcast. It's how he rarely challenges their claims in any meaningful way. Whether it's a guest downplaying the dangers of COVID, denying climate change, or regurgitating thinly veiled white nationalist talking points, Rogan lets them speak unfiltered, unchecked, and largely uncriticized. That creates a situation where bad faith actors can present disinformation with a veneer of legitimacy because, hey, it's just conversation. But conversations, especially on a platform with millions of listeners, aren't neutral. They shape public opinion, they carry weight, and Rogan, whether he admits it or not, is not a curious observer, he's a conduit. This all came to a head when a viral compilation video surfaced of Rogan using an N-word multiple times over the course of his podcast run. The backlash was immediate and intense, like a firework on the 4th of July, and just as brief. And rather than taking full responsibility, Rogan dismissed it as a political hit job. But let's keep it a buck. Calling it that is just a deflection. A political hit job implies a coordinated sabotage by enemies with ulterior motives. What actually happened was that people reacted rightfully to a decade's worth of documented racist language. That's not sabotage, that's accountability. This is where the cancel culture chorus enters the chat. Man, that's a lot of C's for men who just got dental work. Rogan's defenders, especially conservatives, frame the criticism as an attack on free speech, but this argument is deeply disingenuous. First, free speech means protection from government censorship, not freedom from consequence or critique. No one was trying to put Rogan in jail for what he said. They're asking why a man who repeatedly used racial slurs and hosted conspiracy theories was given a $100 million Spotify deal. Secondly, and more importantly, these same conservatives crying foul over Rogan's persecution have perfected the art of legislative cancellation. Across the U.S., conservative lawmakers have passed and proposed bills that ban the teaching of divisive concepts, punish educators who address systemic racism, and restrict discussions of gender and sexuality in classrooms. They push to ban books, demonize critical race theory, and silence historical truths, all because they might cause discomfort for white students or parents, and that's not free speech, that's suppression. So when they defend Rogan, what they're really defending is the right to be wrong without consequence. A double standard where certain people, mostly white, mostly male, can say whatever they want, however offensive or false, and cry victim the moment someone calls them out. And at the heart of this is a refusal to grapple with why people get caught out in the first place. Rogan wasn't being canceled because he made a bad joke once. He was being confronted for a pattern of behavior. And a real reckoning would require him and his defenders to stop dodging responsibility and start asking better questions. Not why are people so sensitive, but why do we keep excusing harmful rhetoric as harmless conversation? But that will never happen, so yeah, c'est la vie. Now, I briefly mentioned that Spotify deal a second ago, and I felt like corporate validation of his average guy appeal. Now, with zero journalistic training, he's treated like a major voice in politics and public health, all while continuing to bridge connections with the right wing through MMA, which I'll get into in a second, and presenting the sort of ideas that your average aggrieved white man could identify with. Essentially, he controls one of the largest echo chambers of primitive thought. I usually say conservative, but the shit is primitive. One of Rogan's biggest strengths is his ability to appear relatable. He looks and speaks like, well, an average Joe. And it should be obvious at this point that this average Joe represents the average center-right white male. This identity is highly marketable because it actually encapsulates center-left men as well whenever they're caught out for their fuckery. You know, the Bernie bro with racist buddies that he justifies hanging out with because his buddy really isn't like that. And by refusing to question anything that challenges white masculinity, he holds space for anyone who could get criticized for a misstep but doesn't want to accept accountability. Joe Rogan's podcast and public persona helped shape an ecosystem where skepticism was repackaged as critical thinking, where challenging mainstream narrative regardless of evidence became a badge of honor. Especially for a certain demographic. White men who felt left behind, culturally unmoored, or uncertain about their place in a changing world.
He felt the impact of that even through his arms. That was a big shot.
In the absence of meaningful ties to ancestral culture, class solidarity, or a broader sense of identity, masculinity became the last thing to cling to. In that vacuum, the MMA world offered more than just a sport. It offered ritual, hierarchy, and a performance of power. Rogan wasn't just a commentator, he was their buddy Joe, enjoying and dissecting their favorite thing, all while selling structure and self-mastery to an audience desperate for both. But that search for structure easily curdled into something more insidious. Rogan helped foster a space where freedom of thought often meant freedom from accountability and where healthy skepticism turned into default cynicism. Guests peddling pseudoscience, vaccine disinformation, climate change denial, and weird lobster theories were welcomed, rarely challenged, and often celebrated for their alternative viewpoints. And over time, that open-door policy didn't just invite contrarian thinkers, it created a pipeline to darker, more dangerous ideologies. That's how the Roganverse became fertile ground for alt-right messaging. This ideological shift dovetails neatly into the paranoia and distrust found in MAGA circles, where enemies aren't just political opponents but traitors, conspirators, and internal threats. It's not a leap from that logic to the kinds of conversation Rogan hosts, where everyone is either red-pilled or a sheep, where truth is always hidden and where moral nuance is crushed beneath manufactured outrage. And yet, even in a space that welcomes grifters and snake oil salesmen, there's a line, and Rogan's encounter with the Liver King proved it.
You don't know who the Liver King is. The guy calls himself the Liver King, and he's this guy who walks around everywhere with no shirt on. I've seen him in Vegas with no shirt on, big bushy beard, super jacked, and he was telling people that the way he gets that way is by sunning his balls and eats raw liver and just lifts like a maniac, and that's how he's so jacked. But it's preposterous.
And the irony is thick. Rogan had helped build the house where figures like the Liver King could thrive, platforming pseudo-experts and anti-science rhetoric and a hyper-masculine aesthetic that prides performance over truth. Rogan himself has advocated for a high animal protein carnivore diet, not sure if he's still doing it, but he pushed all these amazing health effects while also mentioning that he's on a shit ton of supplements. You know, the kind used to supplement all the nutrients he's missing from his diet.
But for me, it's like what I did is I just took a lot of multivitamins. I took a bunch of different vitamins and nutrients and supplements on top of this carnivore diet. So I'm only eating meat, but then I'm taking all the essential vitamins and amino acids, and I'm also taking fish oil. So I'm covering all my nutritional bases,
right?
But I'm not doing it with food.
But the moment he pointed out one of the more obvious cons, the whole illusion cracked. Because when your entire brand is built upon being realer than real, exposure isn't just bad for business, it's a direct threat to the fantasy being sold. And speaking of fantasy being sold, this sort of reevaluation of Joe Rogan and fellow right-wing podcasters has only begun after one of the biggest scandals in modern history landed at their feet, just for those who they supported and campaigned for to try and sweep it under the rug. Rogan and peers like Adam Schultz, Theo Von, and others dubbed down on Trump-era culture wars. The same tired, just asking questions shtick was repeated by the watered-down Rogan rejects. But here's the thing, after years of flirting with conspiracy theories, grievance, and tribal loyalty disguised as open dialogue, reality eventually came knocking. The tipping point arrived when Rogan, alongside some of the very political figures and content creators he once flirted with, fumbled one of the few tangible goals his audience genuinely cared about, the Epstein files. They teased the idea that something big was coming, that transparency and reckoning were just around the corner. Then nothing happened. The very administrators and candidates they supported, who had campaigned on unsealing Epstein's black book or draining the swamp, either reneged on the promises or quietly disappeared from the spotlight.
Do you think, let's play out the logical conclusion of this, do you think that myself, Bongino, and others would participate in hiding information about Epstein's grotesque activities? Or do you think we would also participate in not prosecuting people we had evidence to prosecute people on?
Yes! Yes! And the disillusionment hit, briefly. It became clear that Rogan and his orbit had endorsed a movement with no exit strategy and no actual values beyond resentment. This isn't just about political missteps, it's about a deeper lack of self-awareness. Rogan's massive platform demands a level of critical thinking and emotional maturity that he simply doesn't possess. His strength has always been being in a room, riffing and reacting, making things feel like a conversation even when there's no substance underneath. But that same improvisational charm doesn't work when the stakes are high, when a moment calls for clarity, or when an audience that's been fed anger and confusion for years starts asking for coherence. Rogan, like many of his podcast contemporaries, has built a brand that critiques everything but questions nothing inward. The inability or refusal to grow, to dig deeper, or to take genuine responsibility has left him stagnant, just alone atop an empire filled with sycophants and those looking to exploit his platform. Joe Rogan didn't master anything, but he mastered being there. He's not the villain of this story. Well, I mean, he is, but he's also a victim of his own fortune. Not a calculated evil mastermind, but a living symptom of a culture that mistakes comfort for credibility and visibility for value. He became successful not for his expertise or his insight, but for his proximity to the mic. Always present, always talking, always reflecting whatever his audience most wanted to hear at the time. And when it came time to deliver something real, something true or vulnerable, he couldn't. When success is based on being just enough, eventually demands more than you're able to give. Joe Rogan climbed the ladder of success by being relatable, but in doing so, I don't think the fans actually related to Joe. They related to a mouthpiece regurgitating talking points that reinforced their worldview. He learned that the hard way when he flopped sweat and panicked through his entire Austin comedy special. This made two things abundantly clear. Joe Rogan doesn't really know his audience, and they don't really know Joe Rogan. So I wanted to pause and add one more slight pivot into the mix. I don't want white men to feel as if there is no way out, because if I'm taking away your Joe Rogan option, there at least needs to be someone for you to look at. And for those who need that uncle figure or someone who they can truly relate to in a way that really connects to them as a white male, Bill Burr may be a valid option for you guys. I'm not one for celebrity glazing. I think the dude's funny, but he tends to speak in a way where if I hear a centrist person speaking, they sound closer to a Bill Burr type than a Joe Rogan. And if that's a true balanced perspective you're looking for, then check out someone like Bill Burr. In a final contrast, Burr represents a masculinity that's aware of its impact. He's not trying to be everyone's dad, guru, or thought leader. His comedy, while aggressive at times, comes from a place of reckoning rather than dominance. He confronts his anger, his upbringing, his male privilege, and he doesn't hide behind faux objectivity. Where Rogan couches reactionary opinions in a veil of curiosity, Burr just says, yeah, I used to think that, until I realized I was wrong. So while both men enjoy the benefits of being white and male in an attention economy that rewards both, only one seems genuinely interested in evolving. Bill Burr doesn't claim to be a centrist, he just behaves like one. He's not trying to be a vessel for every voice, he's trying to be accountable for his own. And in an era where so many white male figures claim neutrality while feeding division, that makes him a rare and needed voice. So as it turns out, the everyman, the average Joe, can't really do anything. And it's too late to put the genie back in the bottle. So what now, Joe?